Sometimes a person's destiny changes with a single decision, but to be able to make that decision, they first have to lose everything. The story I'm about to tell you starts exactly like that. Imagine you've got almost no money left in your pocket. You haven't had a proper meal in days. You don't have a place you can call home anymore. You're living through the hardest stretch of your life. And by your side, there's one friend who has no one else but you, your dog, the last thing of value you still have. But hunger sometimes forces a person into choices they never wanted to make. One day, the desperation grows so large that you have to sell him. That moment might be the heaviest decision of your entire life, because that dog isn't just an animal. He's the last piece of your hope. This is the story of that man, Sylvester Stallone. Today, millions of people know him as a star who plays powerful characters, but very few know just how massive a struggle sits behind that success. Because Stallone's story doesn't begin with fame, it begins with loss. His childhood wasn't easy either. A complication during his birth damaged the nerves in part of his face. Because of that, his expression and the way he spoke became a target for mockery for years. People said he'd never be able to act. Some thought he shouldn't even step in front of a camera, but nobody could see the stubbornness burning inside him. He wanted to be an actor, no matter what it took. On the day he was born, the doctors had to move fast. It was a difficult delivery, and one of the instruments used damaged a nerve in the lower part of his face. No one knew in that moment how it would shape his life, but years later, that small complication would leave the corner of his lips slightly drooping and cause his words to sometimes come out a little slurred. It would also become the source of that famous look of his, the stern, determined expression the whole world would come to recognize. Home wasn't easy either. Tension was a constant presence in the family. His father was a disciplinarian, sometimes even harsh. He had big expectations for his son, but inside the house, those expectations felt less like warm encouragement and more like heavy pressure. Little Sylvester felt like he had to prove himself both at home and out in the world. At school, kids made fun of him. When he talked, one corner of his mouth drooped slightly, and his words sometimes stumbled. Even some teachers saw him as the class's difficult kid. His grades were poor, he was impatient, and he was often caught up in fights. For a child, that meant fighting the same small battle over and over, every single day. He moved from one school to another, one city to another, more than a few times with his family. Every new school meant proving himself all over again, fighting for acceptance all over again. A new classroom, new faces, new mocking looks. But some people aren't defined by where they break. They're defined by where they hold their ground. Stallone was one of those people. Sports became his refuge. Bodybuilding, wrestling, football, building physical strength was, in a way, a means of covering that fragility inside him with armor. He didn't want anyone to be able to mock him. He didn't want anyone to be able to see him as weak. The hours he spent in the gym gave him something he couldn't find at school: control. As he built muscle, as he built a body no one could look at and dismiss, the broken kid inside him grew a little quieter. As a young man, he was sent to military school for a while, where discipline and physical toughness came first. That environment taught him how to handle hardship, how to push through pain, how to never quit, perhaps, without knowing it, preparing him for the character he would play years later. But his real dream lived somewhere else. He wanted to be like the men he saw on the screen, like those characters people watched with admiration on the silver screen. Sitting in the dark of a movie theater, he imagined himself as a hero. The boy who was mocked and dismissed out there could become someone entirely different in that darkness. In his college years, he gravitated toward theater and acting classes. His first experiences on stage weren't easy either. Some instructors saw the difference in his voice, in his face, as a flaw, and tried to discourage him. But every time he stepped onto that stage, he could feel something shift in the audience. Maybe he wasn't polished, but he was real, and that realness would eventually become his greatest strength. Nobody believed in him, but he never stopped believing in himself. For years, he went to audition after audition. He was rejected over and over. Every no closed another door, but the next day he'd go knock on a new one anyway. There were days he walked the cold streets of New York, a list of talent agencies in hand, going door to door. Some producers wouldn't even let him into the room. Some took one look at him and said, "This isn't the business for you." Some never answered at all. One time, a director told him flat out someone like him could never be a leading man in film. Maybe he could be an extra. idea. Maybe he could stand in the background of a scene, but be the center of the camera's attention. No. Words like that were enough to silence most people, but there was something strange about Stallone. Every time he heard no, the voice inside him only grew louder. He tried getting by on small roles. He showed up for a few seconds in some films. In others, his name didn't even make the credits. A significant part of his adult life was spent in that painful gap between the life he dreamed of and the life he was actually living. He tried writing too, because if no one was going to give him a role, maybe he could write his own story. But the scripts he wrote met the same fate. Read, set aside, forgotten. Then came the darkest period of his life. His money had run out. He couldn't find work. He couldn't pay his rent. For a while, he didn't even have a place to stay. There were nights he had to figure out where he was even going to sleep. His dreams felt impossibly far away now. During this period, he's said to have spent nights in New York bus terminals. There were days when he spent the last few dollars in his pocket, not on food, but on a bus ticket to get to the next audition. Some nights, he counted himself lucky just to find a bench to sit on. Under the terminal's fluorescent lights, surrounded by travelers waiting with their suitcases, he'd sit there with no idea where his own life was headed. No one looking at him would have said, "This man is going to be one of the most recognized movie stars in the world one day." Sometimes he crashed on a friend's couch, sometimes in the smallest room of the cheapest motel he could find. For a stretch, he even fell asleep watching movies in theaters just to stay warm. It got him out of the cold, and watching those characters on screen refreshed his own dream at the same time. Food wasn't easy to come by either. Some days he managed one meal, some days none. Walking past a restaurant and watching people eat inside made the hunger even harder to bear. But his pride usually wouldn't let him ask anyone for help. His wife was pregnant. A baby on the way meant this was no longer just his own fight for survival. It meant responsibility, and responsibility was the heaviest weight that could settle on top of desperation. There were nights before falling asleep when he must have looked at his wife's growing belly and thought, "What kind of life can I even offer this child?" For a man about to become a father, with absolutely nothing to his name, bringing another life into the world was a weight heavy enough to crush a person. He had exactly one thing left by his side: his dog. His name was Butkus, a huge loyal bull mastiff who stayed by his side and asked for nothing. Butkus was, in those days, maybe his only listener. Stallone would sometimes talk to him for hours about his plans, his disappointments, the scripts he was trying to write. The dog obviously understood none of it, but the way he looked back at him with those big eyes seemed to say that everything would be okay one day. In moments like that, a person asks themselves the same question: should I just give up? Maybe I should just get an ordinary job, give up on the dream, and support my family. Maybe Stallone thought that too. Maybe on more than one night, he wrestled with that question in the dark, but he didn't give up, because sometimes the only thing a person has left is hope. But hope didn't fill his stomach. It didn't pay the rent. One day, the desperation reached an unbearable point. He had absolutely nothing left. His rent was days overdue, and the landlord was running out of patience. He didn't even have money left to eat. And that day, he had to make one of the hardest decisions of his life. He sold Butkus outside a bar to a few strangers. He handed over his one and only friend for about $50. He would later say his hands were shaking as he told the story, that his throat tightened as he held out the dog's leash. Butkus looked back at him as if he sensed something was wrong. Stallone said he could never forget that look. He would say, even years later, that he never forgot the moment he let go of that leash. In that moment, it felt like he wasn't just giving away an animal. He was leaving behind a piece of his own hope. The $50 he got covered a few days of food and a small portion of the overdue rent, but the emptiness inside him was bigger than any amount of money could fill. When he got home, there was nothing left around him anymore. No money, no job, and no loyal friend by his side. The silence of the apartment felt heavier than it ever had before. The corner where his dog used to sleep was empty now. There was only one thing left, that voice inside him that refused to go out. That night, he may have made himself a promise that one day, no matter what, he would get Butkus back, and that one day, he would reach a point where no one could tell him no ever again. But before that day could come, he first had to live through the full weight of hitting rock bottom. One night, he watched a boxing match on television. On screen that night was a boxer nobody thought stood a chance. Facing Muhammad Ali was an unknown local fighter, Chuck Wepner. Nobody believed Wepner could stay on his feet. Everyone expected the fight to end within a few rounds, but Wepner stayed standing. He hit, he got hit, he went down, he got back up. He didn't quit through 15 rounds. rounds. That fight in the ring moved Stallone deeply. That night, one single idea came to him. What if an ordinary man got a shot that stunned everyone? That idea was the moment one of the most unforgettable characters in film history was born. Something stirred inside him in that instant. Maybe all those years of accumulated rejection, all those no's, all those hungry nights had been building toward exactly this moment. Because the story he was about to tell was his own story, not just a boxer's story, the story of anyone who's ever been told they don't stand a chance in life. He wrote until morning. He didn't put the pen down. The words practically poured out on their own, as if everything he'd bottled up for years was suddenly rushing out. The next day, he wrote again, and in a short time, he had a finished script in his hands. According to some accounts, he finished this script in an almost unbelievable 3.5 days. He wrote without sleep, almost without stopping. It was as if every pain, every disappointment in his life had been waiting for that exact day to get down on paper. Its name, Rocky. But the real fight hadn't even started yet. After finishing the script, Stallone took it to his agent. The first reactions were positive. There was something in the story, something simple, something honest, something everyone could find a piece of themselves in. Word spread fast. A few production companies got interested in the script. Then bigger studios stepped in. The offers started coming. First a few $1,000s, then tens of thousands, then numbers that were genuinely huge for that era. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a man who didn't have a dime to his name, who couldn't pay his rent, who'd had to sell his own dog, these numbers meant his entire life could change. All it would take was a single signature. But there was a condition. The studios wanted the script. They wanted the story. But they didn't want Stallone in the lead role. This role wasn't for someone like him, they said. His expression, the way he spoke, the camera couldn't carry him as a star, they said. Instead, one of the well-known, good-looking, already established actors of the era should play the part. Maybe Robert Redford, maybe someone else, but definitely not this unknown man with the odd-looking face, still stuck playing bit parts. The higher the numbers climbed, the more the pressure mounted. At one point, an offer reached a genuinely staggering level for that time. That amount wouldn't just cover the rent, it would secure the rest of his life. And the men sitting across from him kept telling him the same thing. Take the script, take the money, go home. But we can't give you the lead role. This was one of the hardest moments of his life, maybe even harder than the night he sold Butkus. Because this time, what stood in front of him wasn't hunger. It was a tempting way out. Everyone assumed he'd take the money. No one believed that a man who'd gone hungry, who'd been homeless, who'd sold his own dog, could turn down that much money right after living through all of that. But Stallone turned it down. Not once. Over and over. His answer to every new offer was the same. Either I play the part, or this script isn't for sale. The people around him tried to talk him out of it. Some called it madness. Some told him he'd never get a chance like this again. And maybe they were right. Very few people in film history have taken a stand this stubborn, risking the one shot they had. But Stallone saw it differently. He knew that if someone else played this role, he'd remain forever the man who only ever heard no. Even if his script became a hit, that success wouldn't belong to him. The pain, the humiliation, the feeling of being overlooked that he'd carried for years would never go away. This wasn't just a film opportunity for him. This was his answer to everyone who had ever told him, his whole life, you can't do this. Finally, after long negotiations, back and forth, and doubt, a production company agreed to take the risk. The budget was small compared to the major productions of the era. What Stallone would be paid was next to nothing, next to the huge offers he'd turned down. But money wasn't what mattered. He got his script and the lead role, both. The film's set was far from the glossy, big-budget productions Hollywood was used to. The budget was tight. The shoot was short. The crew was small. But the energy on set was different. Because this wasn't just a film shoot. This was perhaps the most important fight of one man's life. In every scene, years of accumulated disappointment, rejection, and hungry nights were showing through. The boxing scenes carried real anger. The training scenes carried real drive. Because the character Stallone was playing was, in truth, himself. Someone nobody thought had a chance, who showed up anyway, who raised his fists anyway. At the heart of the film was a simple but profound message. Winning didn't always mean raising your hand in the middle of the ring. Sometimes winning just meant staying on your feet, making it through 15 rounds without going down. That message would reach something inside every single person who watched it. But first, the film had to get finished. And even during the shoot, no one believed this small-budget film would go on to change the history of cinema. During filming, there was one thing that never left Stallone's mind: Butkus. He never forgot standing outside that bar, the face of the man he sold him to, the moment he let go of the leash. Once he started getting paid for the script, one of the first things he did was try to get Butkus back. Finding the man who had bought the dog wasn't easy, but Stallone didn't give up. He eventually found him. The problem was the man had grown attached to the dog by now, and he didn't want to sell him back. Stallone pressed on. His first offer was turned down. He raised it, turned down again. Finally, for a sum far, far greater than the $50 he'd originally sold him for, the man agreed to give the dog back. That moment may have meant more to Stallone than the film's success itself, because this wasn't just getting a dog back. This was getting back a piece of himself that he'd left behind on the darkest night of his life. When he held Butkus again, it felt like a whole lifetime had passed between the moment he let go of that leash months earlier and this one. And the story was so moving that Stallone carried the experience straight into the film. The character in Rocky had a dog too, and the animal playing that dog wasn't anyone else. It was Butkus himself. The scenes that showed up on screen were, in truth, traces of a real life. By the time the film was finished, even the studio didn't have big expectations. It was a small budget production. There was no recognizable name in the lead role. Nobody thought it would break box office records. But from the very first days it hit theaters, something started to shift. Audiences walked out of screenings with tears in their eyes. People gave it standing ovations after watching. Word about the film spread from person to person, theater to theater, because this film wasn't just telling a boxing story. It was telling a feeling everyone has felt somewhere in their own life. That moment when no one believes in you, but you refuse to stop believing in yourself. Rocky Balboa wasn't a perfect hero. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He wasn't lucky either. He was just an ordinary man, but he was a man who refused to quit. And that's exactly why audiences saw themselves in him. The film became an unexpected box office explosion. Made on a small budget, it quickly became one of the most talked about films of the year. Critics were stunned too. No one expected such a modest production to have this much impact. The film's name started coming up at award ceremonies. Nominations came in, then the awards came in. And that night, sitting in that room, Stallone probably remembered it all, going door to door and getting rejected, the nights in bus terminals, having to sell his dog. He wasn't the same man anymore, but he was there with the same stubbornness, the same drive. Rocky's success didn't stop with a single film. Over time, the character became one of the most recognized icons in film history. That scene of him running up the museum steps in Philadelphia turned into a moment people all over the world imitated and admired. A statue of Rocky still stands at the foot of those steps today, and people from all over the world come to run up them just like he did. The film series continued. New installments followed. Over the years, the character stopped being just a movie hero and became a symbol that inspired millions of people in real life. Rocky became a name people in gyms and motivational talks, going through hard times, reached for to remind themselves of something, because the story at its core told a truth that never gets old. What matters isn't how many times you get knocked down, but how many times you get back up. And that line wasn't just something said in a movie. It was a summary of Stallone's own life. Today, when people hear the name Sylvester Stallone, they picture a strong, self-assured, legendary star. But anyone who's heard this whole story now knows that behind that image sits years of struggle. A boy who was rejected, a young man who went door to door and heard nothing but no, a father-to-be who couldn't pay his rent and had to sell his dog, a writer who turned down the big money and chose to believe in himself instead, and finally, an artist who created one of the most recognized film characters in the world. His story reminds us of something. Success rarely arrives the way it looks from the outside all at once. First, you go through a dark period. First, you lose everything. First, nobody believes in you. But if you refuse to stop believing in yourself, if you keep holding on to that last bit of hope, no matter how faint it gets, one day, that light can turn into a fire. Stallone's story teaches us this. Sometimes the greatest victory comes right after the darkest night. And sometimes the moment you lose the thing you value most is, in truth, the first step of a whole new beginning. Maybe you're going through a hard stretch of your own life right now too. Maybe nobody believes in you. Maybe every door keeps closing in your face. But remember, Rocky's story was never really about a boxer. It was your story, because winning doesn't always mean standing at the very top. Sometimes winning just means staying on your feet. One more round, one more day, one more shot of hope. If this story made you feel something, drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe for the next one.